Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. All of us at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics are delighted to see you for this semester's fourth and final installment in our event series titled Reverent, Irreverence, Parody, Religion, and Contemporary Politics. Just as a reminder, our first speaker, Melissa Wilcox, spoke about the queer nuns who are part of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. We next heard from William Talon and Savitri D., who engaged in conversation about Talon's alter ego, the Reverend Billy, and the Church of Stop Shopping. And the third event, pranksters, stand-ups, and fitness gurus, showcased a panel discussion with Joshua Wright, Sama Chowdhury, Cody Musselman, and Fanny Bialik. Center staff members Hannah Pierce and Deborah Kennard have done extraordinary amounts of work organizing and publicizing all of these events, including today's, as has the creative mind who dreamed up and put together the entire series, Lee Schmidt. And I'd like to take a moment for all of us just to thank the three of them now. I should note that all of these events have been videotaped and are viewable in the event section of the center's website, just as today's will be in a couple of weeks, so you can access all of the recordings there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our final speaker of the series, a fantastic and marvelously creative historian of religion, whom I've now known for 20 years, I realize today. Anthony Petro is an associate professor in the Department of Religion and in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Boston University. From 2020 to 2023, he also served as BU's Distinguished Teaching Professor, a chair endowed by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which enabled him to found BU's Health Humanities Project, and he remains the director of that program as well as director of graduate studies in religion. Professor Petro is a leading scholar of religion in the United States, focusing particularly in the areas of religion, medicine, and public health, and gender and sexuality as they interact with religion and politics. His work has been and continues to be groundbreaking and broadly influential within and beyond both arenas. Professor Petro's first book is titled After the Wrath of God, AIDS, Sexuality, and American Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. This book is the first, and I believe still the only, history of religion and the AIDS crisis in the United States. One that analyzes how American Christians across a wide spectrum of political affiliations and denominations responded to AIDS in the early and middle stages, particularly, of this global health catastrophe. And it traces the trajectory of rhetoric that continues today to fuel heated public debates over religion's politicized regulation of sexuality. That extraordinary book, which I commend to all of you, but I also want to tell you it was the outgrowth of Petro's dazzling PhD dissertation at Princeton University, where he gave all of us around him an eye-popping education in the tragic history that we had just been living through, but had not well understood. Anthony was one of the most luminous minds, as well as one of the most special people I had the chance to work with at Princeton, and it's been a privilege and a joy to watch all that he's accomplishing as a senior scholar in the field. As a book, After the Wrath of God was widely and glowingly reviewed across a range of scholarly and public venues and was a 2016 Nonfiction Book Award finalist from the Religion Newswriters Association. Professor Petro's current project is titled Provoking Religion, Sex, Art, and the Culture Wars, and it's also under contract with Oxford. It tracks a diverse range of feminist and queer artists who have engaged religious themes and ritual in their work and aroused much controversy for it, ranging from works by Judy Chicago and Ray Navarro to more contemporary pieces, and I know we're going to hear more about some of that here. He has already published a number of refereed essays and book chapters in this area, analyzing the performativity of literalism, the arts of secularity, and various moral panics surrounding art deemed sacrilegious or obscene or worse. Professor Petro spent the 2019-2020 academic year working on this important project while in residence at the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. After his lecture, there will be ample time for Q&A, and I just want to ask everyone to wait for the mics that we'll have. We'll have 2 mics, one on either side, so raise your hand and we'll definitely get you in. And then after the conclusion of that, I hope you all can join us for a festive reception outside these doors. His lecture is titled, Playing Sacred, the Camp Aesthetics of Feminist and Queer Art. Please join me now in welcoming to the stage Professor Anthony Petro.
Thank you, Marie, for that wonderful introduction. I can't believe it's been 20 years. I have the receding hairline and wrinkles to show it. But let me start by thanking Marie for that wonderful introduction and thanking my very generous hosts here at the Danforth Center for inviting me to deliver this talk. My gratitude goes especially to Lee Schmidt and to Cody Musselman for thinking up this series, and to Deborah Kennard and Hannah Pierce for helping figure out all of the logistics throughout the day. And of course, thank you all for being here today as well. So this evening, I want to start with the story of this man, who some of you might recognize, Jesus. Let me set the scene of his arrival. Picture it, New York City, December 1989. A man with long, dark brown, stringy hair, a beard, a crown of thorns, joins about 4,500 feminist, queer, and AIDS activists marching down Fifth Avenue to St. Patrick's Cathedral, the seat of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York, led by Cardinal John J. O'Connor. In documentary footage, he speaks to the camera. This is Jesus Christ. I'm in front of St. Pat's Cathedral on Sunday, he reports from the street, holding a microphone in one hand. The sounds of protest blend into the daily discord of Midtown Manhattan. Inside, Jesus speaks over the noise, Cardinal O'Connor is busy spreading his lies and rumors about the position of lesbians and gays. We are here to say, we want to go to heaven too. Jesus joined activists that day to protest the Roman Catholic Church's opposition to abortion rights, safe-sex education, and gay rights. This Stop the Church protest was organized by 2 activist groups, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, or ACT UP, and the Women's Health Action and Mobilization, WHAM. They targeted the Catholic bishops, especially Cardinal O'Connor, who promoted conservative positions on sexual and public health issues in local and national political battles alike. Amidst culture wars fights over gender and sexuality, the church hierarchy reiterated what they considered traditional teachings regarding heterosexual sex, the gender division of the priesthood, the ban on contraceptives, and opposition to abortion, positions that often led other Catholics, especially progressive Catholics, but many lay Catholics more broadly, to be in tension with the official Roman Catholic Church, if not altogether outside of it. A number of protesters, some Catholic and some not, found themselves directly opposing the church hierarchy's involvement in political issues. Outside St. Patrick's, activists carried signs with phrases like, "Keep your rosaries off my ovaries," and "Keep your church out of my crotch." Some dressed in clerical drag, mocking the authority and sartorial stylings of the bishops. Others carried racy pictures, like one of a particularly well-muscled and tumescent Jesus promoting the use of condoms. Inside the cathedral, activists blended with regular Sunday parishioners. When O'Connor started his homily, several protesters began dropping to the floor of the aisles. This mass die-in, playing on both meanings of the word, underscored the many lives lost due in part to the church's positions on abortion and sexuality. That day, Jesus Christ was played by Chicano AIDS activist Ray Navarro, who was a founding member of the video activist collective Diva TV, which was an affinity group with ACT UP. Ray Navarro had moved to New York City in 1988 to join the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program. An artist, filmmaker, and writer, he'd grown up in Simi Valley, California, and graduated from Cal Arts. Navarro, who identified as Mexican-American and as a Chicano activist, was also a leader in ACT UP's outreach to racial and ethnic minorities. In addition to joining activists marching on Fifth Avenue for the Stop the Church protest, Navarro donned his Jesus drag for a series of filmed announcements advocating safe sex and advertising the demonstration. These ads ran on public TV in New York City before appearing in Diva TV's 1990 documentary, Like a Prayer. The film interlaces footage from the protest at St. Patrick's, with interviews with several Catholic and formerly Catholic feminist and AIDS activists. They explain why they were at the protest, offering perspectives that were largely excluded from the mainstream news, which characterized the protest as no less than a storming of St. Pat's by militant homosexuals bent on mocking the church. This footage of Navarro as Jesus also appears in two more recent documentaries, both from 2012. David France's How to Survive a Plague, which was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, and Jim Hubbard and Sarah Schulman's wonderful United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, which, if you ever need to show a film on AIDS for a class, is the one you ought to show. One vignette starts with a close-up of Navarro's face. Jesus turns deliberately to address the viewer. "You may have been wondering where I've been the last couple thousand years," he explains. "Me and my friends at the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power have been busy opposing the church's bastardization of my teachings." At this point, the camera pulls back to reveal Navarro's body. He wears a white robe draped over one shoulder, leaving the other exposed along with part of his chest. He holds up a Bible alongside a bookmark-sized ad for the Stop the Church protest. Have you seen a lot of these around lately?" Jesus asks. "Have you wondered how they could have gone up in such a short space of time? Kind of a miracle, My hand's been in it. Personally," he continues, "I oppose the church's position on abortion, and I'm busy fighting its murderous AIDS policy." In another vignette, Jesus sits against a wall bathed in warm lighting. His Jesus here gestures to the soft, even effeminate glow of the most famous depiction of Jesus in the 20th century United States, Warner Sallman's Head of Christ. He implores his followers, "Make sure your second coming is a safe one. Use condoms." No doubt, many viewers have found scenes like this a little provocative, uncomfortable, maybe even shocking. The mix of reverence and humor, the sacred and profane, the holy with, well, condoms. Is he mocking Jesus and Christians more broadly, one might wonder? Is this an act of sacrilege? Certainly, many conservative Christians thought so. When Like a Prayer landed in the sights of the Christian right, Ray Navarro's unforgettable Jesus drag took the spotlight. In 1991, Donald Wildman, a Methodist minister and founder of the American Family Association, sent out a mailer attacking the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA, for funding the work of anti-Christian homosexuals. Though for Wildman and many others, to call homosexuals anti-Christian, my doing, would be redundant. This time, the target of attack was the homosexual film Like a Prayer and what he refers to as the blasphemous Jesus Christ condom. The mailer included a sheet providing examples of how the NEA spends your tax dollars. The center of the page features an image from Like a Prayer showing Navarro dressed as Jesus holding his condom. In an accompanying letter, Wildman explains that the film was produced by militant gay activists who call themselves Diva TV. The mailer also included a series of pre-written postcards that he encouraged readers to mail to congressional leaders and to then-President Bush. Can I count on you to help end government sponsorship of pornography, anti-Christian bigotry, and pro-homosexual art? The text of the card reads, "Please let me know." After I saw Navarro's Jesus, though, I wanted to know more. I kept wondering how we should understand his role in this protest and Stop the Church more generally, and if there are ways to understand it apart from the polarizing framework of culture wars conservatives. Is this performance merely parody, mocking Jesus? Is it a theological protest? Is Navarro making fun of Jesus or claiming him? Can you do both? I was especially curious about how Navarro's Jesus drag fits within much longer histories of Mexican-American Catholic performance, theologies of liberation, and queer styles of playful engagement, namely camp, which I'll focus on here. I want to suggest that Navarro's camp performance challenges our usual interpretive possibilities for thinking about politics and religion, especially by troubling any clear line between the religious and the secular, or between sincerity and artifice. Camp is usually defined as a sensibility or style, one often attributed to gay male culture in the United States since the 1950s. Its richest sites range from theater and film, especially classics from the mid-20th century, or plays on the classics. Few could forget Faye Dunaway playing Joan Crawford, screaming, "No more wire hangers, ever," in 1981's Mommy Dearest, to drag performances staged nightly at gay clubs and on hit TV shows like RuPaul's Drag Race. In her classic statement on the subject, Susan Sontag explains how camp sees everything in quotation marks. It's not a lamp, but a lamp, not a woman, but a woman. Anthropologist Esther Newton offers 3 defining characteristics. Incongruity is the subject matter of camp, theatricality, its style, and humor, its strategy. A number of writers describe camp as a tool for marginalized communities, a strategy for a situation. Performance theorist Jose Esteban Munoz broadens discussions of camp, usually attributed to middle-class white gay men, to include lesbian and Latinx performance. Camp becomes a site of what he calls disidentification and can be understood not only as a strategy of representation, he writes, but also as a mode of enacting self against the pressures of a dominant culture's identity-denying protocols. Groups like ACT UP connected camp performance to queer politics in several powerful ways, one of which was to take up the Catholic Church itself as an object of camp engagement. Now, Catholicism and camp share a long history, including an obsession with liturgy, aesthetics, and form. The homosocial spaces of Catholic tradition, from the all-male hierarchy to women's convents, have long served as sites of sexual suspicion and aesthetic possibility. Outside the formal Roman Catholic Church, drag activists like the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence have, since the late 1970s, donned habits as they parade around gay ghettos, blessing their patrons and teaching safe sex. Like real nuns, the seriously parodic sisters, as Melissa Wilcox shows in her brilliant study, undergo a period of training and take vows, in this case to promulgate universal joy and expiate stigmatic guilt. They also have been accused of anti-Catholicism. Like the work of the sisters, Ray Navarro's Jesus drag is threatening, not simply because it is camp, but because it takes place outside the authority of the Catholic Church. It brings something of the sacramental to the people, and not just any people, to lesbians and gay men, feminists, and people with AIDS. Ray Navarro's Jesus, along with Diva TV's film Like a Prayer and the very public debate over the Stop the Church protest itself, appear as one episode in a longer history of disputes over cultural production in the United States, which have ranged from popular music to high art. In the late 20th century alone, Americans fretted over the supposed dangers of disco, punk rock, and the so-called degenerate lyrics of rap music, as failed Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork put it in hardly veiled racist terms. The Christian right assailed films like The Last Temptation of Christ as sacrilegious, and attacked television shows like Murphy Brown and music videos by pop stars like Madonna as unfit for broad audiences. Much of the heated rhetoric turned to issues of sexuality and sacrilege in the work of visual and performance artists, especially those who received funding from the federal government. Conservative criticism of the NEA would come to a head in the late 1980s and 1990s, sparked by a series of public outcries over what Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor later dubbed provocative art. Infamous debates over the work of visual artists Andre Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe come most readily to mind, as the Christian right repeatedly invoked their supposed sacrilege and obscenity to raise alarm and funding for their own moral crusades. The book I'm finishing now, called Provoking Religion, Sex, Art, and the Culture Wars, tracks these pitched battles over sex, art, and the sacred in the US from the 1970s into the 21st century. My work expands the archive of moral debate to include visual and performance artists like Ray Navarro, Judy Chicago, the duo Bob Flanagan and Sherry Rose, Marlon Riggs, David Wojnarowicz, and Renee Cox, all of whom would in turn take the public stage in culture wars battles over sex, art, and religion. When I started this research, I wanted to understand how artistic production became a key site for these cultural collisions over the politics of religion and sex, both for conservatives alarmed by challenges to social norms rooted in the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, and for progressive and radical artists confronting sexism, homophobia, and racism. I began with 3 guiding questions. Why were feminist and queer artists disproportionately targeted by culture wars conservatives, especially those within the Christian right, who attacked their work as blasphemous, anti-Christian, or pornographic? How did conservative Christians leading these attacks understand this artistic work? That is, what habits of interpretation, which of course could include a refusal of interpretation itself, shaped their attacks? And finally, how and why do so many of these artists who got in trouble and who are often presumed secular, if not anti-Christian, draw so frequently on religious iconography in their work, and to what ends? What I learned is that answering these questions requires pushing back on the entrenched narratives of the modern culture wars themselves. Too frequently, both in news media coverage and in much of our scholarship, we uncritically adopt a conservative framing of these battles. Indeed, I argue that the culture wars narrative itself is a conservative framing. In its simplest form, the culture wars narrative pits religious conservatives against secular progressives. This framing emerges from a longer history of modern secularism that places moral conservatism at the heart of what we think of as religion, which is often reduced to propositional beliefs about God and to moral codes, especially those having to do with gender and sexuality. This approach takes a particular kind of religion, conservative Christianity, as a template for religion writ large. In this story, religion restricts gender and sexual freedom, while secularization lets it go free. Here, religion and sexuality, especially queer sexuality, are positioned against one another. It becomes difficult within this narrative to consider how religious traditions, texts, or art might foster sexual pleasures. Historians of religion and sexuality have begun chipping away at this narrative that sets religion against sexuality, but it continues to haunt the ways we frame the culture wars. Let me offer 2 additional observations to situate how I think we might talk about religion, sexuality, and art. My first observation: scholars and lay observers of religion alike often assume that whatever it is we call religion ought to be serious and sincere, or at least it should result from performed earnestness, as in the case of hugely popular televangelists who tapped into longer histories of dramatic evangelical affect. Even the US Supreme Court places a premium on religious beliefs being sincerely held when confronted with challenges to religious freedom. Scholars of religion have rightly countered efforts to reduce religion to sincere belief in God or adherence to various creeds by foregrounding not only what religious people say and believe, but also what they do. We often call this lived religion. But even this approach too often privileges sincere actors working from the best of intentions and figures religion as arising from presumably authentic and even reverent convictions. Alternatively, scholars, often historians, sometimes try to explain away religious motivations that appear contrived, perhaps presuming that some real intention having to do with economics or politics drives religious behavior, or relatedly, that religious people are merely acting in bad faith, exploiting religious language for specific needs. Sometimes these approaches, foregrounding religious sincerity or bad faith, absolutely make sense. But the reigning assumption that religious actors are either sincere or dissembling makes it hard to see how religion can be taken up in ways that are ambivalent, ironic, or humorous, or how it can animate artistic visions outside the logic of insiders and outsiders. Here's my second observation. In the midst of culture wars debate, religious and political conservatives who oppose feminist and queer art often read visual art and performance in a particular way, through what we might call an aesthetics of literalism. Steeped in a Protestant hermeneutics of images and a long history of Scottish common sense realism, the aesthetics of literalism names a style of reading visual culture that transforms images into words, seeking to fix meaning in place in order to prevent the slippage of sentiment into sensuality that images too often risk. Of course, literalness is not uniquely conservative. We all appeal to literal claims, and many progressive artists discussed here employed literalism to creative or didactic effects. literalism as a way of understanding language nonetheless unravels, because it is in the nature of language, and much more so with images, to exceed the fixity toward which literalism aspires. When I discuss the aesthetics of literalism in this work, I'm trying to capture how conservatives literalized visual and performance art, how they applied not just a literal, but a literalist lens to work that often resisted such readings. A literalist interpretation insists on one possible meaning, and more on a reading that, in its own self-description, denies its very status as a kind of interpretation. Literalist interpretation, in this sense, insists there is no interpretation at all, just obvious meaning. The act of literalizing art in this way, or of producing literalist readings, became a key tactic in culture wars politics. At the same time, Provoking Religion seeks to demonstrate how these artists were no mere provocateurs or anti-Christian secularists, nor were they simply moral relativists or nihilists, as they have often been characterized not only by right-wing culture warriors, but also by sociologists and historians of the culture wars themselves. To be sure, sometimes artists were those things, but often they were visionaries and myth makers, transgressors and prophets. After spending years reading in the archives of these artists and observing their work, I found that far more often than simply mocking Christianity, they strive to express legitimate criticism of conservative religious institutions and leaders, and to foster new political and spiritual visions of their own. Let me say this a bit differently. One of my goals is to intervene in the prevailing ways we write about and how we understand feminist and queer artists in the culture wars. Too often they pop up as instigators of dispute or fuel for right-wing fires, but they are rarely considered on their own terms. More often they are characterized as defenders of free expression at best, if not reduced to the right-wing caricatures of their work. The effect of these moves is not only to overlook the voices and visions of progressives and radicals, including how religious language and imagery animates the imagination of the left, but once again to make feminists and fairies into ornaments of national spectacle rather than key participants in our public culture. By focusing on specific artists and the debate surrounding them, I hope here today in this larger project to bring into view the wide range of religious imagery and thinking from which these artists drew, and often to very different ends. While Catholicism is central to the story my work tells, I also emphasize how artists drew from feminist spirituality, transcendentalist and New Age currents, and progressive Judaism, often in various combinations, in ways that reveal ongoing historical struggles to define the relationship between the sacred and the political in public life. Just as importantly, many onlookers took up these works of art not only as instances of sacrilege or public pornography, but just as often as sites for visual piety, as David Morgan calls the devotional use of images. To better understand this history, we need to look at how feminist and queer artists frequently subverted, appropriated, or ironized religious and spiritual forms, often using humor, parody, and camp. Let me round out our discussion with a final example, one drawn from the pantheon of feminist art, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party. I find this example productive as it counters a widespread tendency to script feminist art and politics as wholly secular and wholly sincere, rather than potentially ironic and even funny. First exhibited in 1979, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party has been in turns lauded as a feminist masterpiece, attacked as a relic of feminist essentialism, and derided as mere kitsch. Now installed permanently at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, the Dinner Party is, in a word, monumental. It features 39 place settings for mythical and historical women in Western history, equally lined along three sides of a triangular table, moving from the primordial goddess to Hildegard of Bingen to Georgia O'Keeffe. Setting atop handmade period-specific runners, each place setting save two includes a plate hand-painted or sculpted in Chicago's signature butterfly vulvar imagery. The table sits over the heritage floor, which is composed of smaller tiles featuring 999 additional women lauded for their contributions to feminist history. Lately, I've been thinking about the dinner party alongside Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, a classic text in feminist and queer theory, which was published in 1990, the same year that the dinner party would enter the culture war spotlight when it came to the attention of DC conservatives. I've been thinking about them together not merely to register historical shifts in feminist politics from the 1970s to the 1990s, but also to reevaluate pitched battles over the political and aesthetic work of the dinner party. Following Butler's writing on gender and the possibilities for gender subversion they see in drag performance, I'm especially interested in exploring camp readings of Chicago's work. I also want to consider here the strange career of Chicago's dinner party itself and the ways religious readings and literalist readings have often made it hard to see its feminist and Jewish humor. When the dinner party was first exhibited in March of 1979 in the San Francisco Museum of Art, it gained immediate popular success. Crowds lined up to see it. Upwards of 5,000 showed for the opening alone, and somewhere around 100,000 people came through during its first 3 months. The installation conjured feelings of religious experience and transformation with its dramatic restaging of Leonardo's Last Supper. Chicago saw the dinner party not merely as a catalog of women's history, but also as part of grand myth-making, a feminist creation story. The dinner party, she explained, is a work of art that is women's history, women's religion, women's metaphor. It gives women something they never had, a history, a mythology, a religion, a cultural identity that is their own. The vulvar imagery on the dinner plates spoke to popular strains of feminist spirituality and politics, and its celebration through this play on the Last Supper invited women into the sacred triangle. In the Village Voice, Diane Ketchum lauded the dinner party as an awesome undertaking. She quoted an older woman seeing the exhibition with her. "I felt I was in church. It was like visiting the cathedrals in France. She made these women into something holy." In another review, Susan Havens Caldwell likewise captured the devotional feeling of the exhibition. Voices were hushed in the darkened room as viewers proceeded very slowly around the brilliant triangle, visiting each place setting as if it were a chapel. The dinner party received a cooler reception among many feminists and art critics who found in its popular appeal, feminine imagery, and transgressions against modernist aesthetics more symptoms of kitsch than signs of the sacred. Again, religious language animated their responses. One reviewer derided the dinner party as no better than mass devotional art, while another dismissed the women who file worshipfully past this cunnilingus as communion table. Journalist Dorothy Shin complained that the piece wasn't really art at all. Chicago's work, she claimed, is first and foremost an indoctrination. It is the religiofication of the feminist cause. Kay Larson, writing for The Village Voice, faulted Chicago, these are her words, for not being more open about the gay theme, sitting down to dinner before plates depicting women's labia. Larson connected this sapphic sensibility to Chicago's spirituality. How, she asks, do you create a major art event that speaks for all women, yet derives mainly from your personal involvement in the goddess cult? In Art Forum, Hal Fisher drew the religious resonances more closely to the problems with the piece's literalism. Chicago's conception originates in her own interpretation of medieval art, he writes. Just as art taught the Bible to illiterates, so should the dinner party instruct us. To this end, the presentation is obsessively literal and cloyingly ecclesiastic. The piece suffered, he continued, from proselytizing self-righteousness that replaces art with cultism and offers literalism under the guise of education. Observe the confluence of religion and kitsch here. Popular religion and kitsch taste, both feminized and devalued, come together for many of the dinner party's fans and detractors alike. I'm especially interested in how they motivate accusations of literalism, sincerity, and explicitness. No review better captures what I mean than conservative art critic Maureen Malarkey's Dishing It Out, which appeared in the Catholic magazine Commonweal. This cutting review describes the dinner party moving around the country like an itinerant revivalist, abetted by populist resentments and generating its own awakening. Like Fisher, Malarkey bemoans the didactic nature of the imagery and the preachiness of the exhibition, which is outdone, she writes, only by the prettiness of it. Malarkey attacks the dinner party and the feminist art movement as a whole for its attempt to challenge conventions of the high and the low. This folkish desire, these are her words, this folkish desire to pit intellect against feeling and its willingness to play on the susceptibilities of its audience is a continuation of the fundamentalist impulse in American Protestantism. Chicago's iconography, which Malarkey faults for its abuse of sincerity, lacks the hilarity of Marcel Duchamp and shares more in common, she writes, with Karl McIntyre, the well-known fundamentalist pastor. After the fundamentalism of the cross and the flag, she quips, we now have the fundamentalism of the vagina. If for Malarkey, the feminist and religious sincerity of the dinner party proved even more damning than its perceived sexual explicitness, this inflection would soon shift in the coming decades. By the late 1980s, Chicago was searching for a permanent home for the dinner party. She had been in conversation with leaders at the University of the District of Columbia. The plan was that she would donate the dinner party as part of a new multicultural center, where it would join an expanding collection of feminist and African-American art. The installation required building upgrades, the costs of which would quickly come to the attention of journalists and politicians in DC, who suddenly lit upon what they considered a misuse of public funds to celebrate a controversial piece of art. In Congress, Senator Jesse Helms complained that the dinner party was, in his words, clearly pornographic, while Congressman Robert Dornan read from a copy of the Washington Times, "This is not art, it's pornography, 3D ceramic pornography." That same paper had declared wrongly that the dinner party was, in their words, banned in several galleries across the country because it depicts women's genitalia on plates and has been characterized by some critics as obscene. I'm especially interested in these accusations of literalism across the dinner party's career. What work have such accusations done to construct this piece variably as feminized, religious, sacrilegious, didactic, or pornographic? Following the dinner party's debut, some feminists worry that it reduced women to their sexual organs, but most early accusations of literalism, largely from art critics, underscored the obviousness of its feminist message. This transgression of the prohibition against direct representation, glimpsed in Chicago's vulvar plates, skirted the orthodoxy of modernist art. Such accusations thus pointed to the dinner party's gender trouble, as its religious sensibilities, mass popularity, and kitschiness only confirmed its transgression against the masculinist norms of high art. By the 1990s, the dinner party would find itself amidst a somewhat different swirl of gender trouble. The religious readings of the dinner party that had been so central to its previous celebration and its denunciation alike were largely absent in the 1990 debate, as critics narrowed their attention to charges of explicit sexuality. Of course, we're dealing with different sets of actors with different intentions, but the shift is instructive. Conservative politicians and Christian leaders repositioned themselves on the side of religion and the dinner party against it as a moral pollutant threatening American morality. In this reading, the dinner party's sexuality was no facet of the goddess cult, as a previous critic charged. Indeed, few commenters at this moment even noted the Christian or Jewish iconography or feminist spirituality animating the piece. We might think of this shift not as a forgetting, but as a pedagogy of unseeing, an unseeing of the religious elements others had observed, experienced, and criticized before. For conservatives in the 80s and 90s, the problem wasn't that the dinner party was too religious or that its symbolic representation too obvious, but that it was literally or explicitly depicting women's genitals. These readings reduced the dinner party to its plates, decontextualizing them from the piece as a whole, as they rendered the butterfly vulvar symbolism as explicit female genitalia, labia, or plated vaginas. Their complaint is not that the symbolism is too obvious or that women are reduced to anatomical organs. It is that women's sexuality is on public display. And such literalizing readings were not limited to the right. The New York Times repeated the rhetoric of conservative attacks, even leading Chicago to respond with a letter requesting the paper of record to stop referring to the plates as female genitalia. She balked at the use of what she called such inappropriate clinical terminology to describe my abstract, organic, aesthetic, not anatomical forms. Chicago offered a prescient conclusion. It is shocking to me that the New York Times employs authoritatively the language of the right-wing anti-arts faction in America. I could understand the distorting language coming from the Reverend Donald Wildman of Tupelo, Mississippi. I cannot understand it coming from the New York Times. I want to be clear here that I'm not suggesting accusations that the dinner party is pornographic are necessarily sincere or produce successful literalist arguments. Rather, I'm attempting to trace a style of interpretation and aesthetics of literalism employed in the culture wars that has constituted much of the scene of debate over feminist and queer art. The power of this approach makes it harder to ask how and why religious iconography animates so much feminist and queer art without assuming we know in advance the answer to such a question. And yet these very literalist arguments produce an excess they themselves cannot contain. If such habits of interpretation sought to limit Chicago's symbolism, I mean to say, they also inaugurated other forms of imaginative possibility. I want to close by considering the fantasies conjured through attacks on the dinner party, which trade Chicago's abstract, organic, aesthetic forms for descriptions of vaginas served up on plates. Indeed, rhetoric that literalizes Chicago's feminine symbolism quite often conjured the explicit sexuality found there. In the Washington Times, Wesley Pruden insists that Miss Chicago's sculpture actually depicts a table set with dinner plates serving up vaginas. Yes, Virginia, vaginas of famous women of history. Such descriptions, summoning the explicit sexuality of the dinner party, also raised the specter of lesbian eroticism. Pruden described how an employee at his local adult bookstore even interpreted Chicago's piece as, in his words, a Dyke's eye view of some of the tough broads of the past. Of course, such pornographic fantasies, thank you, Fanny, such pornographic fantasies are not progressive. They reveal the limited vocabulary available to imagine a feminist iconography without reducing women to biology or to patriarchal fantasies of lesbian ghosts. Indeed, we should note how all too often the comedy of the dinner party comes in making fun of it, rather than seeing humor in the work itself. But at the risk of stating the obvious, I don't think it should be too hard to find the humor, Judy Chicago's humor, in recasting the Last Supper with a table of vulvar forms. If we see the joke in this, surely it is Chicago's. So we might ask, why do so many people miss the humor of this work, the way it plays with feminist, Christian, Jewish, and goddess imagery? Why do so many see here only women's sentimentality rather than feminist humor? I want to suggest two related reasons, and they won't surprise you. They are gender and religion. First, gender. Melissa Jackson sums up the long-standing stereotype when she writes, in her words, feminists, and by extension their work, are by nature serious, and comedy is by nature inherently carefree, clearly a dichotomous construct that would prohibit any collaboration between the two. Christopher Hitchens, one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, put it more succinctly, if in a more sexist way, in the pages of Vanity Fair, where he explained, women aren't funny. Second, religion. As we already know, we often assume religion itself to be earnest and patently unfunny. In fact, Hitchens drew this point about religion together with the point about gender. In all societies, he declared, it is females who are the rank and file mainstay of religion, which in turn is the official enemy of all humor. It's probably fitting that someone who spent so much of his career dicking around couldn't see the impotence of his own thinking. But he wasn't far from alone. The refusal to understand that both feminist art and religion could be funny, often drawing on parody or irony, leads too many people to miss its campy, even subversive possibilities and its Jewish aesthetics. Maureen Malarkey's acerbic review, which I quoted before, is especially generative here. A conservative Catholic, Malarkey bristled at Chicago's feminist politics and metaphorical iconography. Her reading repositioned the dinner party as Protestant, as part of a folksy religion committed to simplicity and sincerity. Malarkey's language is so over the top, the fundamentalism of the vagina, that it makes it hard not to laugh because it's so absurd. It led me to wonder, what if we leaned into such readings of the dinner party as being kind of kitschy, too sincere, or exhibiting flamboyant excess, as Amelia Jones has noted? Can we recover camp readings of the dinner party, and in doing so, also restore the sense of feminist and Jewish humor so often missed? I'd like to insist that the dinner party contains some tension between sincerity and humor. On the one hand, Chicago has often characterized it as an earnest lesson in women's history. But it also offers its own drag performances, a Jewish feminist's revisioning of The Last Supper, a piece that's already kitsch given its mass paint-by-numbers appeal, The dinner party represents key women throughout history in symbolic butterfly vulvar drag, and not only women, but also mythic goddesses invited to this Passover Seder. Refusing Susan Sontag's partitioning of camp as a gay aesthetic from Jewish humor, Anne Pellegrini has explored the potential for Jewish camp, noting how Christian dominance and heteronormativity remain overlapping sites of cultural power. In a recent book, Jenny Kaplan traces the history and meaning of Jewish humor from the silent generation to today. For Kaplan, humor becomes another way that Jewish Americans perform their Judaism, and we can see this in much of Chicago's work. There is something excessive about the dinner party, about its exhibition and reception, an excess of imagination, of sensuality, of seriousness, of hushed tones and choreographed devotions, of polarized commentary that works alongside its sincerity. I don't intend a camp reading simply to recuperate the dinner party or to denigrate it, but to proliferate additional ways to see the work it does and the work it may do, the subversive laughter it might invoke, perhaps even the possibility for conversions and subversions to come. Indeed, Chicago herself has become a camp object for artist Audrey Chan, who playfully recreated a piece called Practicing Judaism that captures some of the humor often missed in feminist art. By donning Judy Chicago drag, Chan has called herself Judy Chicago's Chinese-American doppelganger. She forges a connection to a feminist and artistic mentor while also playing with questions about art, identity, and humor. She piles drag upon drag upon drag. If anything, we have underthought how religious iconography animates the dinner party in creative and perhaps subversive ways. Serving up vulvar drag at the Last Supper suggests not only a didactic move, but a funny one. Not an abuse of sincerity, a critique that Christianizes the piece, but feminist political humor stylized through religious forms. If its future may or may not be religious, but it need not be literal either. So it might seem odd, especially from the perspective of conservative Christians, for a Jewish feminist like Judy Chicago to find value in playing with Christian iconography and ritual, like the Last Supper, which was, of course, a Passover Seder, and to render it into a form of feminist incarnation. It may seem odder still for a gay Chicano man with AIDS to dress as Jesus, to call for safe sex education, and to criticize the Catholic Church, and to do so in a way that was both parodic and deadly serious. But read against centuries of Christian history, it's not so unusual. There's quite a long and diverse tradition of Jesus drag. The Lamb of God has survived many incarnations, taking form as a queer Chicano person with AIDS, or inspiring goddess-themed plates should hardly prove the most damning. But perhaps they are among the funnier ones. And perhaps, without a bit of religious humor, to paraphrase the good book, we will be ever hearing but never understanding, ever seeing but never perceiving. For what is this feminist and queer art, if not parable in visual form? Thank you.
We have plenty of time for Q&A, and I think the mic's in the back, so just raise your hand high.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
In the spirit of like the discussion about the misappropriation of like federal tax dollars, especially as it pertains to art, I'm curious if there was any like people from the opposing side criticizing the misappropriation of federal funds by installing like overtly religious figures into like things like the Commission of like Pornography or whatever that long title is, and whether people like Wildman celebrated this as like some objective moral victory, or if it was like, I don't know, if he had to like reconcile that to people.
Wait, can you say it one more time?
Yeah.
The question, thank you.
The entire question?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, just a little bit,
Yeah. Were people like Wildman forced to have to reconcile the misappropriation of government funds and tax dollars for like the appointments of overtly religious figures in these like secular offices, or did he like celebrate that as a moral victory and like completely ignore its questionable legality?
Yes, I see. He ignored its questionable legality if it benefited his cause, right? So I talked a little bit about the problems in approaching religion as merely bad faith. But in some of the figures of the Christian right, it really makes sense to think about how they're working in bad faith. And sometimes they really were working in bad faith, and really trying to use as many arguments as they could to advance a particular moral cause. Now, from their perspective, using any tools at their disposal to advance their cause is, to their minds, what they ought to be doing. So they didn't necessarily see a problem with that. But for somebody like Wildman, I think if we're looking for a consistent vision of the relationship between, say, religion and law, or religion and the state, I don't think we're going to find one there, outside of a sense that he does think that although, while Wildman doesn't go as far as some other members of the Christian right, he doesn't go so far as to sort of call for something like a Christian theocracy, but he did think that American society should be culturally Christian, culturally evangelical, and he thought that the state could play some role in fostering that, if that makes sense. Thank you for your question. Were you in the class this morning? I thought so. Awesome. Great.
That was really fascinating. I appreciate your reframing of the culture wars narrative very much, as you know. And I may have missed this, but I didn't hear you talk about feminist or queer Catholic readings of these pieces. I may have missed this in what you said, So I'm just wondering because there is a large population, certainly of feminist Catholics, but queer Catholics as well, who are, always trying to do a lot of different things in that position, all different kinds of ways. So I'm just wondering where those voices are in all of this, or if they're there, what you could say about that.
Yes. So they're definitely there. So there are many feminist and queer people operating both within the institutional bounds of the Catholic Church, and there are many who would identify as maybe culturally Catholic and have felt pushed outside of it. And certainly over the course of the 80s and 90s, with the devastation of the AIDS crisis, a lot of queer congregations like the MCC or different gay Jewish groups were also sort of meeting and thinking through the meaning of the AIDS crisis alongside the rise of the Christian right. And we see so many progressive Christians and Jews trying to think about how to confront this particular moment. So often in the way that these events are covered in the media, it falls back on that rhetorical framing of the culture wars that tends to posit conservatives on the side of religion and then finds the most, sort of secular or anti-religious examples. And indeed, I've tried to show how even protests like Stop the Church, often issued from really frustrated Catholics who were angry at the church and wanted to do something about it. And AIDS activists leading up to the Stop the Church protest debated whether to even focus on the Catholic Church and O'Connor in particular, whether if they were to do this protest to go inside the cathedral itself, they worried about appearing like they would be attacking Catholics themselves rather than the church hierarchy. And they in many ways spoke as both Catholics and as former Catholics, and many members of queer Catholic groups like Dignity really found themselves not knowing quite what to do. So in 1986, then Cardinal Ratzinger enforces a letter that kicks gay-affirming groups like Dignity outside of Catholic spaces. So even before the Stop the Church protest in 1989, members of Dignity were staging what they called the Cathedral Project, which was a protest movement where they would stand at the back of St. Patrick's in silence to protest the fact that their pro-gay group had been kicked out of all Catholic Church spaces. So they were there. They were absolutely there. They were often, providing readings of some of the things that were considered anti-Catholic and saying, this wasn't really an anti-Catholic thing. So there's an example with Stop the Church where one of the activists, the best account for it actually comes from a priest who is in the cathedral who is writing about this as a terrible thing, but he talks about this activist who's shaking and tears are coming down his eyes as he takes a communion wafer and crumbles it and lets it drop to the floor. And this was picked up in all the major papers in New York as this sort of key instance of queer, feminist, anti-Catholic protest. And Bob Pucillo, the president of Dignity in New York, convened various leaders of Dignity, and they decided that this was not an act of sacrilege because the wafer could not be consecrated if O'Connor was angry. It can't be consecrated in a moment of anger. And so it wasn't officially the body of Christ. These are quite tendentious kinds of arguments, but they illustrate how queer and feminist Catholics were trying to think about these questions. Certainly there's a longer history of feminist Catholics as well, and their depictions of Christ, including a female Christ, that we can see as part of this history. There's one there and there.
Thanks. Hi, really enjoyed your talk. Thanks so much. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you choose your cases. Because, how you explain to us what camp is, obviously, but can something be not camp enough or borderline camp, or, how do they make the camp cut?
That's a great question. And indeed, the question of whether the dinner party is camp or not camp, it's fundamentally up for debate. The thing about camp that I find fascinating as an analytic is that something can be camp, like we can describe it as campy, so it can function as an adjective. It can also function as a verb, right, coming from its original use in French. So you can take something up as a camp object, right? So something like the dinner party, there's this question of whether it is camp or whether it is a prime object for camp thinking. And I think it could be both of those things, right? So camp is both something that can inhere in an object, and it can be something that we do with objects to reclaim them in new ways. When I was thinking about how to put together the cases, the artists I wanted to talk about in the book, I knew that I didn't want to focus on Robert Mapplethorpe and Andre Serrano, about whom much has been written. When you think about the culture wars and art, those are the two artists that most frequently come to mind. And I find them very interesting, but there's just been a lot said on them. So I was trying to find artists who gained national attention, and who entered into controversies in the midst of culture wars debate, who used religious iconography in ways that I thought could be interesting, that weren't clearly just doing it to be offensive, or that weren't, clearly just doing it to be reverent either. And so I came up with a series of examples from Judy Chicago, who's the earliest, to Renee Cox, a Jamaican-American artist whose photo montage, Yo Mama's Last Supper, became an object of controversy in the early 2000s when it was put on display at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. I write about other places than the Brooklyn Museum, but it does come up a lot in this project, as do New York artists. And one of the things that I found, and this in hindsight makes a lot of sense, but a lot of these artists were working through Catholic iconography. Even Jewish artists like Chicago or Sherry Rose were also working through very much Catholic iconography, often alongside Jewish ways of thinking, Jewish forms and aesthetics, goddess forms of aesthetics. But Catholic imagery was just there consistently. And I think it's because there really is this a long historical relationship between Catholicism and camp sensibilities. where it has this sort of focus on the liturgical, the focus on costume, the focus on performance and aesthetics, right? So it becomes the object for, the Met Gala, it's taken up by fashion designers. Camp itself becomes the theme of the Met Gala, although the performances of camp were terrible. They're all horrible camp. They weren't camp, they were just bad. But nonetheless, right, there's something about that sensibility that just lends itself so easily to this. And my thinking was why does this Catholic iconography appear so much? Why does it animate this work? And what does it do if it's not there merely to mock Christianity, which I don't think it is?
Hi, Anthony. Thanks so much for the really wonderful presentation. And I'm going to hopefully take some of these examples and teach them in my class, too, to get people to think about sort of breaking apart the boundary between like religion and art. Because I used to just teach the New York Met Gala, and now I'm like, more examples, perfect. I was curious about the kind of uptake for these works. And I think you flagged two. One is either the sacrilegious, or two, they are pretty strong political commentary. I'm wondering if you could say something about confusion or frustration as another potential uptake, and that's something Chicago has thought through in the sense of, because I can imagine, like, say I'm teaching the Last Supper case here. Like, I know some students are already asking, like, what's the Last Supper? Or what am I supposed to get from this? And I want to do something with that uptake, or at least that response from students, knowing that I'm sure there are some viewers who would also feel the same way. And maybe the longer commentary behind this is the adoption of religious sort of aesthetics relies on an already pre-existing understanding of what those religious registers are. And I can imagine that that's changed so much, perhaps, given to challenges to religious literacy, for example. And I'm wondering if that's something that Chicago has also sort of thought about or anticipated as, like, there is a short shelf life for how this could register in the way that I want to register. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've thought about in your own work as well. So there's a lot of questions there, but feel free to take any of them, whichever of them sound interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are great questions. I'll start with a little bit of a story. I teach this seminar called Sex, Art, and the Sacred, where students are invited to look at different works of art and to do a close reading of them before they know what it is, right? So I have a list of like 9 objects that they can choose, of one of which is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. And they have to pick one that they don't already know about, and I don't label what they are. And the first part of the assignment is they just have to close read the art. And several of my students decided to close read The Dinner Party, and their first reading, with no context at all, just looking at it for the first time, obviously in an image rather than going to the Brooklyn Museum and seeing the installation itself, but they thought it was about hunger. Several students thought it was about hunger because it has these plates that are empty, right? And I was like, that's so fascinating, right? I mean, because in some ways it shows the fault in the argument that this is like clearly women's genitalia, right? That it's literally like labia, right? It's clearly symbolic, and some people don't even get the symbolism, right? So it's a symbolism that, in some registers, like once you have a sense for what it's doing, it can seem obvious. I understand that, right? But many of us don't have the habits of reading to fully know what's going on. And so as you're asking, what happens if somebody doesn't have the foreknowledge of the Last Supper, the history of Leonardo's version, the many ways the Last Supper has been taken up by people like Warhol and many other artists, Rene Cox, or what the Last Supper was, what it was actually doing, or why someone like Chicago would restage it in this way, which The Dinner Party, it makes use of a lot of feminist spirituality symbolism. So the lineup of 13 is meant not only to mimic the number of disciples, but also the number of witches in a coven. The triangle is taken up as a sacred feminine form. The use of textiles is a nod to the sort of period-specific women's crafts of different moments. The choice of different goddesses and historical women speaks to a particular vision of Western women's history that Chicago is working with. And yes, a lot of this is just not going to be obvious. And indeed, I would argue that the many times I've been to the dinner party at the Brooklyn Museum, I kind of watch people as they walk around because I'm curious in how people engage it. I would say, I don't know, I don't talk to them because I'm afraid of ethnography, but they don't seem to really, they just kind of walk in and they kind of mosey around and they kind of chuckle a little bit. They don't seem to fully understand every, political and spiritual resonance that Chicago is going for. And indeed, I'll frame this in one last way. So I don't know, when Chicago was making this in the 70s with her team of apprentices, I don't know that she was thinking how this might read 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. That I don't know. But I can tell you that as Chicago was developing the female core imagery for which she becomes known, she found that so many people couldn't recognize what it was, right? That it wasn't clear enough. And so she started writing words on it. So you see in her art in the 70s, I think I have a slide, let me, oh yeah, there it is. So you can see here, this is this image. Part of her Great Ladies series, and this is the one devoted to Marie Antoinette. And you can see where she actually starts writing around it. So she has to be more literal because people aren't getting the imagery that will later be accused of being, absurdly obvious. So there's a lot going on there in terms of how Chicago is trying to understand her project and make it more clear. So she finds that she has to provide these kinds of descriptions precisely in order to democratize it for people who are not familiar with the artistic and religious conventions upon which she's drawing.
I'm wondering if you can talk about the political instrumentality of camp and satire, in ACT UP and Navarro protests. What is their intended mechanism? Is it to shock the church? Is it to chisel, devout Catholics off to get them to join through shock and displaying the gaps in the church? I mean, what's the intended mechanism with these tools?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer it in two ways. One, camp, especially as it developed in the mid-20th century, was often understood and was certainly understood by early writers about camp like Susan Sontag as specifically apolitical, right? That it tended to be associated with sort of gay men's fixation on, the arts and beautiful Tiffany lamps and fabulous diva celebrities and these kinds of things. So it was seen as opposed to the political. It was seen as kind of this effete ornamentation or affectation of gay men. Others have sort of pushed on that and said, no, camp is a way that people who were marginalized made sense and made fun of where they were. So camp wasn't for other people, it was for them to express and have joy and sort of make fun at things and subvert the high and the low in ways that would sort of reveal the absurdity of those hierarchies to begin with. So it was very inwardly focused in terms of the community. Certainly by the 80s and 90s, queer and feminist activists, and especially groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation, made camp political. And if you look at the history of queer protests and of ACT UP protests in particular, right? It's a lot funnier than a lot of other protest movements in its aesthetics and the kinds of things that it's doing. Like, it has a lot of people in drag, it has a lot of sexual references, it has a lot of people laughing and joking, and it doesn't often have the solemnity and sincerity that we see in other kinds of protests. Not that it was totally absent, but it tended to be marked by rage and by subversive humor, right? Camp is not organized enough to have like a clear political agenda, right? It's not like a Marxist movement. It's more kind of neoliberal. It's like individual. You kind of play with it. It takes resonance within a community. But if you just focus on something like Ray Navarro's performance of Jesus, right? On the one hand, it was a character that he liked to play. He just really enjoyed pretending to be Christ. Secondly, he, as a member of this Diva TV collective, wanted to dress up as Jesus and work as like a news correspondent to report on the protest. So he didn't necessarily want to go in the cathedral, but he could stand outside and be Jesus walking down Fifth Avenue. So it's this eruption of Christian iconography in the public square that is so often invisible to people who think religion in public must look like something else. But in doing it, he's drawing as much on Mexican-American popular devotionalism, performances of the Stations of the Cross, as he is in sort of queer drag and this idea that we can take this up and inhabit this role. And like he says, we're here to say we want to go to heaven too, right? So it draws from this sort of history of liberation theology. And his performance was utilized in advertisements leading up to the protests so that people would know about it. He promoted safe sex, right? So when he's saying, please make sure your coming is a safe one, use condoms. It's funny, but it's also meant to educate people about condom use. And then films like Diva TV's Like a Prayer, which was really made for a feminist and queer community, were circulated in people's houses and in queer bars where people in the community would sort of watch it. And it was a way where they could process what was happening, think about why is it that so many people thought this protest was anti-Catholic or that it went too far. And it really gave them a way to think about it, to process what was happening, to understand their own lives in that sense. So I would say that at its best, those are the kinds of political endeavors that camp allows. I mean, others, Judith Butler and others would make stronger points about how camp can work to subvert norms of gender and so forth. I mean, that's pretty well-trodden work, but in terms of this, I think that's the most salient way.
Having lived through that time, I was just going to add that ACT UP had lots of different types of protests, and they reflected who the target was. So they delivered coffins to public officials that they considered responsible for not dealing with the crisis. Slipped into the New York Stock Exchange and chained themselves to that famous VIP balcony where you see people ringing the bells to fight the high cost of drugs. When you come to the cathedral, I mean, just look at it. And look at the way the priests are dressed and all the ornamental. It just fit to respond the way they did. It was a perfect reflection of the group that they were targeting, who were targeting our community at the time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to build on it, another target of their protest was Randall Terry's Operation Rescue, the anti-abortionist group. And ACT UP activists formed a troop that they called Operation Ridiculous, where they dressed up as clowns who opposed abortion. And they would go around talking about save the babies, dressed as clowns with bullhorns, right? So your point is exactly right. I mean, their protest tactics would often meet the kind of things that they were fighting. They put a condom on Jesse Helms's house at one point. Like early in the morning, they drove to his house and unfurled a huge a huge sort of makeshift condom on his house and blew bullhorns outside. But they also staged what they called the Ashes Action, where as the AIDS quilt was on display in the National Mall in the early 90s, they took the ashes of their loved ones, went to the steps of the White House lawn, and threw them over the fence, right? That's a very different kind of protest that doesn't partake in a camp politics in the way that something like Stop the Church would.
Right. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm so interested in what you just pointed out about Chicago providing some descriptions or more text to help make some of the politics of her work a little bit more legible. And it seems to me is that that's possibly feeding an aesthetics of literalism, and is also maybe why some people missed the camp or the humor within the project. So I was wondering, within all of your case studies, if you've noticed a pattern in the moment of capture when it comes to the aesthetics of literalism.
Yeah, no, this is a great point. I've tried to think about this a lot with the dinner party in particular, because it really does start, I think, from this moment of humor. And then as it becomes bigger, and I mean, at first she wanted to paint plates and put them on a wall, and then it kind of expanded. She's going to have, a table set for 13. And then she's like, oh, I want to include more people, so we need to add more people. It just got bigger and bigger, right? And then, as often happens in the history of religions, it develops a whole apparatus, right? She has, hundreds of people working for her and with her. She literally has to found a foundation to help raise money and to care for it, right? So it becomes institutionalized. And then she starts to pitch it more and more as a lesson in women's history. And that allows her to do some things, right? It allows her in the 80s and 90s to develop, say, curriculum for people to teach the dinner party in schools, right? Like, you can't really teach this to middle schoolers if you front load the sort of funny sensibility, but if you teach it as women's history, right, and make it really earnest and evacuate it of some of the funnier irreverence, then it opens it up for those kinds of things. And so I think she encounters this sort of tension between, it starts with this idea that's quite funny. Serious too. I mean, she really does want to think about the place of women, obviously, but sort of thinking about it in this funny sense, to reverting to ways to describe it to larger and larger audiences. And then as people start experiencing the dinner party, they experience it as such an earnest spiritual experience, right? So what is she going to do? Be like, hey, it's a big joke, that's kind of unsatisfying. So I think she kind of goes back and forth. You kind of see her at one point saying, yeah, maybe I need to make this a little bit more serious to appeal to these wider audiences. And she's also open to the idea that, look, people take this work up in different ways. I think she was thrilled by how it was taken up and its mass popularity. But she also really wanted it to be shown in museums more than in these grassroots sites. But museums often wouldn't have it. So she had a really hard time finding museums that would display it, partly because it's really big and difficult to display. You need a lot of space and a lot of money to display it, but often just because it was considered craft rather than art, right? So she did encounter a lot of sexism from museum leaders, both because of the feminist crafts that went into it, and because it was just so popular, right? Something that popular couldn't be real art, of course. She does other funny works. So on the one hand, she creates works like the Birth Project and the Holocaust Project that explore issues dealing with women and reproduction, with the history of the Holocaust. But she also did a project on her relationship to Leonard Cohen and the Kohanim, and sort of thinking about their shared Jewish history and mythologies. So she has these moments of real humor, and so I see her wrestling with that quite a lot in her career.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thanks, Anthony, for the great lecture. One of the patterns we've seen now over the course of the lectures is this, the ways in which earnestness tends to eclipse humor. So we saw this with the sisters. There's a way in which the stories that we ended up dwelling on, Melissa dwelled on, were the ones where someone had a very serious religious background. So it looked like this powerful engagement with Catholicism, rather than just an out-and-out religious critique, right? So that's the story that got foregrounded, just how serious everyone was, how real the nuns were. And then with Reverend Billy, we thought we were getting, a faux preacher, someone who was, playing at being Jimmy Swaggart and using it for his leftist purposes. And then it turned out, no, he really wasn't interested in that anymore. He was much more interested in being a real preacher. So that got downplayed. And I see it here too, right? I mean, in the way you were talking about Judy Chicago, I see it in the emphasis on Ray Navarro rather than, say, the Operation Ridiculous, right? Which seems like that they're just trying to be funny. I mean, they don't have an investment in the Catholic symbolism or in the Operation Rescue's work. They just want to try to deflate its significance. So I'm wondering what you think about that. I mean, is there a way in which we get pushed in that direction? I mean, it seems like part of the logic is, right, sincerity is the prevailing value, right? So we're going to get pushed to emphasizing that rather than just dwelling on the more explicitly anti-religious folks. And that's not to say, right? I mean, I love the fact that the left has a much richer religious imagination than we realized, right? I think that's great. But I do think there's this other side, and I'm wondering how we, if that is something that just consistently gets downplayed because of these other pressures we have. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I can tell you that if I ever want to just diffuse a potential conflict around whether something might be deemed anti-Catholic or not, I just double down on, well, Andrew Serrano is really a Catholic. It's okay, right? And I don't like that move, right? I for many reasons, am frustrated by that move, but it also works. Right? It's a way to diffuse some of the sort of anxieties that people have that someone might be appropriating something inappropriately, right? I think it's clearest with Judy Chicago's uses of Christian iconography because she's really not a Christian. She's secular, she's Jewish, sometimes she's less secular, sometimes she's more Jewish, sometimes those are the same things. And the way that I write about it in the introduction to my book is I try to say, look, I don't want to over-theorize people's religious convictions, and I don't want to over-theorize whether somebody is an insider or an outsider. So rather, I offer what I think of as a low theory approach to religion, where I say it makes more sense in these cases to think of religion as like a language. And by that, I don't mean to reduce religion to language or to say that it's merely linguistic, but rather to think about the way we come into religion like the way that we come into language. It's something that we use. Like, I don't have an earnest attachment to English. I can use English earnestly or satirically or ironically, but I don't have an earnest attachment to religion. It's just, to English. It's just the language that I grew up speaking, and that sort of saturates how I think. It animates my thought and how I understand and encounter the world. I think for many of these artists, that's how religion functions. That's how Catholic and Christian iconography function, even for someone like Judy Chicago, right, who's growing up in Chicago in a predominantly Christian country. She learns to speak the language of Christians. And I think as someone who is fluent, and she might not be as fluent as Ray Navarro or as Andre Serrano or Robert Mapplethorpe, but as someone who grew up in the United States where there's Christian cultural dominance, as someone who's Jewish, I think she gets to speak that language and use it when she wants to. And it doesn't need to be earnest and it doesn't need to be satirical, but it could be either of those things. So that's how I tend to think about it. I try to get away from the insider outsider or whether it's coming from an authentic position or not by thinking about it as like a language, as one of the tools that we use to animate the work that we do. And that helps me at least kind of push away from the worry that, whether someone is really Catholic or really Christian. The other way I can answer the question is, if I gave my talk on Bob Flanagan and Sherry Rose and their sadomasochistic Catholic performance, we might have a good conversation about some of the trouble that they get into with the crucifixion scene. Yep. Thank you.
Well, we can continue our Q&A and conversation over drinks and food outside, so please join us for the session. And say thank you so much to everyone.